involved in the solidarity movement know this isn't new. We've faced it for decades. But what is new is the fact that Israel has been losing support consistently, and the boycott movement has grown in strength. But at the same time, the interests of the Israel lobby have coincided with the interests of the right wing in the Labour Party and the interests of the gutter press. And together, they've formed a coalition that has been able to achieve far more than any of them was able to achieve in the past. We've seen huge numbers of people disciplined in the Labour Party, suspended from the Labour Party. We've seen attacks on students. We've seen attacks on lecturers. And we've put a lot of effort into defending freedom of speech, which is really important. But one thing that has been lost in this, and part of the purpose of this onslaught, is to actually remove the space for people to talk about Palestinian rights, to talk about what's going on in Palestine, and to talk about the Palestinian struggle. So we're really pleased to have here today 3 people who are going to speak about Palestinian rights, about censorship, about anti-Semitism, but about anti-Semitism and the way it is being used to prevent talking about Palestinian rights rather than as in isolation. And after the speakers, who are going to speak for about 12 minutes or so each, after they've finished, we'll have time for discussion. The chat has been disabled, partly because we know that many of these meetings have been infiltrated in the past by people who are inimical to our interests. So if you want to chat, comments will only be seen by the hosts of the meeting. If you ask questions in the chat, we'll pass them on to the speakers, but there will also be space after the speakers are finished for people to indicate that they want to speak, and we'll call as many people as possible to take part in the discussion. I'd like to start by welcoming Bashir Abu-Manneh, who's a Palestinian activist, lecturer in comparative literature at the University of Kent, and author of the recent book, History of the Palestinian Novel. I think it's History of the Palestinian Novel in the 20th Century, who's going to put the whole issue into context for us. So, Bashir, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Sure.
And speak for 12 minutes or so.
I didn't know I was beginning, but it's fine.
Oh, sorry, I should have arranged this.
No, it's fine. Coming. Thank you.
Yeah, we can hear
you. So you can hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I thought today, in the brief time that I have, the first thing I thought is to lay out the logic of the letter, which I was asked to talk about, the letter that was published in The Guardian on the IHRA definition and the question of Palestine. And the second is to examine what is behind Israel's ideological assault on free speech. Why is it so vicious, and why there's a top-down approach through institutions of state power. So I'm going to propose that Israel is silencing free speech rather than engaging in argument, because it has become extremely hard for Israel to win an argument in public. It has become hard to hide these obvious facts, that during a so-called peace process, the occupation has deepened and has worsened, that there's a huge power imbalance between Israel and the Palestinians. We have a nuclear power armed to the teeth with the most advanced technology versus a defenseless occupied people that manages to muster very primitive homemade rockets at best. And that finally, as every human rights reports reiterate often, Israel is the one violating the right. So if you're Israel,
sorry, Bashir, your sound quality is really poor. Are you able to move closer to the microphone or something, because it keeps cutting out?
Yeah, maybe it's the reception, or maybe it's the internet. Is that better now? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're Israel and you do not want to rectify these facts, you don't want to do anything about them, you don't want to change them, then cover them up. Israel thus bullies and criminalizes those who draw attention to these facts. It accuses them of anti-Semitism, of supporting terror, and it weakens, confuses, and disorganizes opposition to its plans. Does it work? Yes. I would say look at the Labour Party and tell me it doesn't work. In the grand scheme of things, this silencing tactic keeps delaying justice for the Palestinians. So before considering this political context, let me just say a couple of things about the letter that appeared in The Guardian, which I signed. It's also worth pointing out that this letter also appeared in equally prominent venues in Arabic, in Al-Quds newspaper, in Hebrew, in Haaretz, and in newspapers in Germany and in France. So it had a global kind of effect. Signatories were some of the most prominent writers in the Arab world. They took a robust public position against anti-Semitism, and they also voiced their support for teaching the lessons of the Holocaust and of other genocides, including teaching them in the Arab world. The spirit of the letter was universal. It was critical of exclusionary nationalism. It was committed to international law and to human rights as the best way to fight racism and to fight oppression. It also called for an acknowledgement of the political realities of Israeli aggression, its national dispossession of the Palestinians and occupation, while at the same time affirming the rights of both Israelis and Palestinians to live in security and safety. It also advanced self-determination as a form of non-domination over others, as the best route to justice and to peace for both peoples. So on the question of anti-Semitism, more specifically, the letter affirmed the definition of anti-Semitism adopted by the IHRA, but it objected to, as is common, to the examples that the IHRA provides as evidence for this. The key issue here is whether you can state the following things, some of which are just simply facts, without being accused of anti-Semitism. Whether you are free to say that actually existing Israel is a racist state, that not a hypothetical state of Israel was founded on ethnic exclusivity, ethnic expulsion, and military conquest against the wishes of the majority of Palestinians then, that it is a state whose laws and practices since foundation are structured to benefit Jews over actual non-Jewish citizens of the state, which now constitute not a small minority, they constitute 20% of the population. That it is a state that allocates core rights based on ethnicity rather than citizenship, so that it is not a liberal democracy, but an ethnic state. What else is the nation state law in Israel today, if not the latest codification of Jewish supremacy in Israeli law? So other key issues that come up are whether you can criticize Israel's daily aggression against millions of Palestinians that it occupies, whether you can say that Israel's wars and occupation contravene international law, violate human rights for the Palestinians, deny Palestinians their internationally recognized right of self-determination, whether you dub any Palestinian resistance granted to any occupied people as anti-Semitic, including non-violent forms like BDS. So because the IHRA examples conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, those things are not possible. Drawing attention to some obvious facts can land you with the accusation of being anti-Semitic. And this is the way the definition, most importantly, has been mobilized in reality, by weaponizing and exploiting and abusing anti-Semitism in order to protect Israeli state power, by calling anti-Zionism, which is a long tradition in the Jewish community, anti-Semitic, by targeting progressives around the world who called for a peaceful means to end the occupation, by finally exempting Israel from criticism or from calls for sanctions for its illegal conduct. So what the Guardian letter also objects to is the idea that you are oppressed, but you have no right to express this fact or your suppressed history, lest it offend your oppressors. That is simply morally and politically unacceptable. So let me turn now to why I think Israel and its supporters are doing this. I think here, as was alluded before, political context is essential. Since as far back as the Lebanon War in 1982 and the First Intifada, Israel has escalated its attacks on Palestinians and has, as a result, been losing popular support around the world. Its image has changed. We used to think of Israel as a victim state. It has changed now to an intransigent occupying power. This has happened most dramatically since the Second Intifada. I'm just going to give you some examples about this changing conception of Israel around the world, some examples about the perception of Israel. So in a BBC World Service poll conducted in 2013, Israel was one of the world's least popular countries, at the bottom with Pakistan, Iran, and North Korea, with 52% negative influence perception. North Korea had 54%. Another important example comes from the Pew Research Center in the US and its Global Opinion Survey, which was also conducted in 2013. So a little bit before the second war, big war on Gaza. The results are also very, very clear. The US is the only country surveyed where a majority expresses positive views of Israel. Around 57% of Americans have a favorable opinion of Israel. We can talk about why that is the case later on if you like. And 27% have an unfavorable view of their country's closest allies, one of the country's closest allies in the Middle East. In predominantly Muslim countries, as well as, and this is very important, as well as in France, Germany, and Britain and China, majorities or pluralities express negative opinions of Israel. In Lebanon, it's 99%, Jordan 96%, the Palestinian territories 94%, Egypt 92%, Turkey 86%, Tunisia 86%. All of these countries offer unfavorable views of Israel. Majorities in China around 66%, France 65%, Germany 62%, also express negative opinions of Israel, as does 44% plurality in Britain. So the British case, of course, is very important for our purposes because of what has been happening recently in the country. In answer to the question, and this is from the survey I'm discussing, the Pew survey of 2013, in answer to the question, and I'm quoting, now thinking about the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians, which side do you sympathize with more, Israel or the Palestinians? Sympathy for Israel consistently hovers around 20%. This is between 2003 to 2013. On average, it's 20%, ups and downs in different years. But the strongest and most consistent trend in Britain is the rise of support for Palestinians from 28% in 2003 to 35% in 2013. This increase was also registered in France, which was up from 36% to 44%, which is, again, very high. Though there was also an increase, unlike in Britain, in support for Israel as well. We can talk about that as well later on if you want. Another worrying fact for Israel is that support for it is declining among Jews in the US. Israel's ongoing occupation and its wars on Gaza jar against Jewish liberal views and their Jewish support for human rights. There's an increasing trend of totally disengaging from Israel, and this is very important and very worrying for Israel, or being neutral about the conflict. So another survey I will discuss, mention, is the one that was conducted on the Jewish population in the San Francisco Bay Area in 2018. This was reported on in Haaretz on 14th February 2018. And this is a direct quote from the article. It says, while far more, 43% of those asked said they sympathized with Israelis than those citing the Palestinians, which was 8% sympathizing with the Palestinians. Almost half of those surveyed said they either sympathized with both sides, neither, or were not sure. Most troubling for Israel are the views of the new generation of Jews in the US, amongst, and this is again from the report itself, amongst 18 to 34-year-olds, only 11% described themselves as very attached to Israel, and only 37% said they felt the existence of a Jewish state was very important. For a state that spends so much money and puts in so much effort on public relations and official state propaganda of Hasbara, these results make pretty stark reading, I think. What they indicate is that there are key populations around the world, core constituencies, that are either neutral or that have negative views of Israel and strong sympathies with the Palestinians, which is on the rise. If you combine these statistics with the hard political facts that still an overwhelming majority of states in the UN still support Palestinian statehood and they support the Palestinian right of self-determination, Israel has a serious diplomatic and political problem that threatens its ongoing occupation. So what we can conclude from this is the following, that it is Israel's loss of prestige and loss of public sympathy that ultimately explain the increasingly violent, aggressive efforts, including the current IHRA one, to silence discussion about Israel's political and military conduct. Everything Israel does, it does in order to foreclose the implementation of the international diplomatic consensus over Israel-Palestine. Weaponizing anti-Semitism is today part and parcel of Israel's efforts to hold on to the occupied territories and to block Palestinian statehood. Let me just say one more thing before concluding. I'd like to end by suggesting something else about the way anti-Semitism is being mobilized, the way the strategy works. That invoking anti-Semitism as a form of state protection, essentially, from criticism, performs another important ideological function for Israel. It actually obscures the realities of the conflict and allows Israel to present itself as a victim of discrimination and injury, as the injured party that is merely trying to protect its people from attack by supporters of terrorism and by spreaders of hate. So the Israeli Prime Minister makes this point all the time. I'll just give you two examples. In 2016, in response to the UN General Secretary's comments about Palestinian violence at the time, he was talking about the what's so-called knives intifada. He described it as violence which was expressing the despair of Palestinians at being occupied and being denied their rights for so long. Netanyahu immediately accused Ban Ki-moon of stoking terror and added the following, and this is a stunning statement. The Palestinians, he said, this is a direct quote, the Palestinian terrorists don't want to build a state. They want to destroy a state. And they say that proudly. They want to murder Jews everywhere. This is Netanyahu. And they state that proudly. They don't murder for peace, and they don't murder for human rights. So yet again, Israel is merely defending itself against terrorists who want to destroy it. Yet again, Israel wipes out of history the fact that the PLO has already recognized Israel back in 1988, and that Hamas has de facto accepted the two-state solution for over a decade now, and has won an election based on this new political pragmatism, new political moderation back in 2006. Netanyahu totally inverts this reality that it is Israel that is denying the statehood for the Palestinians and denying them all basic human rights, not the reverse. So indeed, for Netanyahu, fighting the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza and anti-Semitic or terror attacks in France are the same thing for him. They are both a form of Islamic anti-Semitic terrorism. This idea is quite familiar and repeated everywhere by Netanyahu, that we in Israel are like you in the West, we are fighting the murderous hatred of Islam. Just another example before I finish. In January 2015, Netanyahu said the following. He said, Israel is being attacked, this is another direct quote, by the very same forces that attack Europe. They might have different names, ISIS, Boko Haram, Hamas, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, but all of them are driven by the same hatred and bloodthirsty fanaticism, end of quote. So we have this ongoing strong association between Islam, terrorism, and anti-Semitism, kind of an ideological mantra, which is deeply Islamophobic. It is the notion that Islam breeds violence and hatred for Jews. But who calls Netanyahu an Islamophobe by suggesting that? What is extremely peculiar and rather ironic is that while Netanyahu bandies these false conflations around between groups fighting the occupation and an international terrorist network like Al-Qaeda, he himself cooperates with known anti-Semites, like Viktor Orban in Hungary or the Polish Prime Minister. This fact wasn't lost on Israel's main historian of European nationalism, who sadly died recently, Zeev Sternhill, who called out Netanyahu for this and stated that Israel now, and I'm quoting from his article, sees itself as an integral part of this anti-liberal bloc led by nativist xenophobes who traffic in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, end of quote. What matters for Netanyahu is not Orban's anti-Semitic demonization of George Soros or Poland's denial of their responsibility for the fate of Jews during the Second World War. What matters is their current support for his right-wing government, for right-wing Israel, a very cynical politics. For Netanyahu, so long as you support him, your views about Jews and Jewish suffering don't seem to matter. For him, what is good for Israel is good for Jews around the world. If the IHRA definition, I think, teaches us one thing, it is that this is not necessarily the case. We need to say loud and clear that we are against antisemitism and that it should be uprooted wherever it is found, that we are against Israeli state oppression of the Palestinians and denial of their human and national rights, that no state is immune from criticism. Thank you very much. An Islamophobe by suggesting that. What is extremely peculiar and rather ironic is that while Netanyahu bandies these false conflations around between groups fighting the occupation and an international terrorist network like Al-Qaeda, he himself cooperates with known anti-Semites like Viktor Orban in Hungary or the Polish Prime Minister. This fact wasn't lost on Israel's main historian of European nationalism, who sadly died recently, Zeev Sternhell, who called out Netanyahu for this and stated that Israel now, and I'm quoting from his article, sees itself as an integral part of this anti-liberal bloc led by nativist xenophobes who traffic in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, end of quote. What matters for Netanyahu is not Orban's anti-Semitic demonization of George Soros or Poland's denial of their responsibility for the fate of Jews during the Second World War. What matters is their current support for his right-wing government, for right-wing Israel, a very cynical politics. For Netanyahu, so long as you support him, your views about Jews and Jewish suffering don't seem to matter. For him, what is good for Israel is good for Jews around the world. If the IHRA definition, I think, teaches us one thing, it is that this is not necessarily the case. We need to say loud and clear that we are against antisemitism and that it should be uprooted wherever it is found, that we are against Israeli state oppression of the Palestinians and denial of their human and national rights, that no state is immune from criticism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bashir. That was very useful in putting the issue into context. Before we go on, just two technical points. First, if you post any comments, please can you add your name? Zoom is not letting us know who makes the comments, and it makes it very difficult to follow them up or to reply to them. So if you want to post anything to hosts, say who you are. The second thing is, this is being recorded, but we are only recording the main speakers. So there should be no security concern for other people. If you're worried that you see the recording button, you are not being recorded, but this should go online later and you'll be able to direct other people to it to watch the fascinating discussion. The next speaker will be someone I've had the privilege of working with for many decades, and probably everybody has now heard of Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi, who made a fiery speech at Labour Party conference a couple of years ago, who's been active in support for Palestinian rights for very many years, active trade unionist, and as you will have read, has recently is vice chair of Chingford and Woodford Green Labour Party, but has just been suspended for reasons that are not entirely clear. But Naomi is one of the more prominent targets of the current witch hunt campaign, and we're very pleased to have her here to speak again for 12 minutes or so on the current situation. Please unmute yourself, Naomi.
Yes, Roland, thank you very much indeed for that full introduction. Yes, I was indeed suspended along with the chair of Chingford and Woodford Green CLP and many others, growing numbers we're hearing day to day, that more leading officers have been suspended without reasons being given other than the vague, you know, we have reason to believe you may be in breach of rule book chapter 2 clause 1.8. Anyway, we won't get into that. Thank you very much, Roland, for your initial introduction, which at first I thought you were going to leave me nothing left to say, particularly having heard Bashir now. We're well into a deep discussion of these issues tonight, and I'm sure many people on the call are very well informed as well. As Roland said at the beginning, anti-Semitism allegations have long been the chosen weapon of the Israel lobby to demonize Palestine, Palestinians and their supporters. And a reasonably recent example of this was in 2002, so predating the current wave, predating the attempts to demonize the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. In 2002, former Israeli education minister Shulamit Aloni was asked why people who express dissent against the policies of the Israeli government are labelled anti-Semites. And she said, well, it's a trick. We always use it. When from Europe somebody is criticising Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in the US people are criticising Israel, then they are anti-Semitic. It is very easy to blame people who criticise certain acts of the Israeli government as anti-Semitic and to bring up the Holocaust and the suffering of the Jewish people to justify everything we do to the Palestinians. So I don't know whether that was an unguarded moment or whether she's in the habit of revealing the background to Israeli tactics and strategies in that way, but that says it all really, doesn't it? I think it was very noticeable for people who've been supporting the Palestinian cause for many years, as Roland has, of course, and many of you on this call. Once the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement started to gain traction from 2004, 2005, when it was first announced, this is when the demonization of people who supported that Palestinian-inspired tactic became increasingly subject of anti-Semitism allegations. So let's just remind ourselves what BDS is. It's to do with freedom from occupation. It's to do with justice for refugees. It's to do with equality for all citizens of Israel. And these are all causes which are legitimate as human rights under international law, so that they shouldn't be questionable. So how does Israel go about questioning them? By establishing the idea that the motivation behind those who support BDS is hatred of Jews, and that you can see a very entertaining, if not rather horrifying, clip of Gilad Erdan, the Minister of Strategic Affairs, making a presentation about the hateful coalition of forces who are globally attempting to destroy poor little Israel, that vulnerable Jewish state, you know, the Jew among nations, for no reason other than their hatred of Jews. And he talks about the Red-Green Alliance. So there's this attempt to associate green, Muslim, as Bashir very eloquently explained, you know, the demonization of Muslim people as if they were all terrorists, and red, the left. So that here we are, it's communists, it's Islamists working together to destroy the Jewish state. And he actually calls it the hate net. The hate net. And one of the intentions here is to try and peel away liberal support for justice for Palestinians, for the movement of solidarity, and particularly for boycott. So there is a very coherent movement of cultural boycotts against Israeli cultural institutions. And you'll have heard sort of campaigns by the Zionist forces, build bridges, not boycotts, this sort of idea. And they've been quite successful in demonizing the idea of boycott, likening it to Nazi boycotts of Jewish shops and that sort of thing, completely ignoring the fact that we're dealing here with a quite legitimate and peaceful civilian action against a powerful state, analogous to what happened in South Africa against apartheid. Now, in the early days of BDS, the UK was identified by the Israeli state institutions as a centre of BDS support. But I think the United States was initially their main lobbying focus. That's where the power lay internationally in the White House. And you'll have heard of the major lobbying organisations such as the America-Israel, God, I can't remember what the PAC bit stands for. Somebody will tell me. AIPAC, the ADL, other groups who actively and quite consciously lobby for Israeli interests, and of course against BDS. But of course in 2015 something dramatic happened, to everyone's amazement, including the gentleman himself. I think Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, and the focus shifted to very much focusing on the UK and on the Labour Party because of the threat that a movement around Corbyn, however reformist, however harmless in fact, the idea that there would be somebody who represents a kind of anti-colonial perspective, who might break the North Atlantic Alliance in international affairs, who would actually attempt to bring about a shift of power within British society. This was horrific to a huge layer of British society and wider, the Israeli state, the American state, and so on. So not coincidentally, I'm sure, the Jewish labour movement suddenly, after being dormant for decades, leapt into existence. The first thing that you will find on its website is in early 2016, attacks on the Oxford University Labour Club with allegations of anti-Semitism, which have been shown to be almost entirely fabricated. We had the creation of so-called Labour Against Anti-Semitism, a sister group of the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which itself was set up in 2014 during the Gaza war with the explicit role of protecting Israel from criticism for its horrendous acts against the Palestinian people. And we also had Nasher Jew, unpleasant Twitter account, which made it its business to use anti-Semitism allegations against supporters of Palestinians wherever they could find them, and people like David Collier. And all these organizations were given so much credence by the mainstream media. It's utterly shocking, the lack of scrutiny, the fact that journalists have for the last 5 years simply not done their job in respect of the allegations of anti-Semitism thrown at people in the Labour Party. And as again Roland explained, we're talking here about a confluence of interests, and the Zionist lobby have been using this tool of anti-Semitism allegations for a number of years already. Now with Corbyn as it's seen as a threat to the entire establishment, this tool, this weapon, was seized upon and used, sadly, with great effect. And that we're still seeing that going on, even though Corbyn has effectively been destroyed as a political force. So heads began to roll. You'll all have heard about Ken Livingstone, Tony Greenstein, who I think may be on the call. If I hadn't been suspended already, I'd be suspended for being on the same call as Tony, because he's already been expelled from the party. Jackie Walker, Mark Wadsworth, a whole number of prominent, effective, committed anti-racist campaigners who are also anti-Zionist were among the most prominent victims of this purge. And now that Corbyn has unfortunately been forced out of the leadership, and he's now no longer even on the Labour benches, the purge is given free rein now. We have a personage called Luke Akehurst on our national executive, thanks to the weakness of the left and its inability to mobilise its forces effectively. This is a man who runs an organisation called We Believe in Israel, among many other front groups with which he's associated. He's very well embedded in the Labour bureaucracy and very well respected by the old guard. And he uses his contacts. So just before PSC Palestine Solidarity Campaign held its virtual lobby of Parliament this year, Akehurst had the temerity to circulate a letter to all his contacts saying PSC is asking people to contact their members of Parliament to tell them lies about Israel, telling them it's an apartheid state. Of course it isn't. It's a utopia. It's heaven on earth. Completely undermining a quite legitimate Palestine solidarity activity. And this man is on our national executive. I say our, I don't know how much longer I'll be able to say that really. And of course we have a leader, Keir Starmer, who showed recently on LBC that his adherence to Zionism was so total that he was unable to confront a white supremacist spouting the most horrendous racist nonsense, because she cleverly linked what she was saying to what goes on in Israel. Well, if in Israel it's all right for the white folks to run things in their interest, why can we not do it here? And he had no answer. It was absolutely shocking. And one has to ask, is this deployment of anti-Semitism allegations in all directions actually of use in dealing with the genuine rise of anti-Semitism from right-wing sources? And of course the answer is no, it isn't, not at all. In fact, the converse is true. And I think we can see it sort of hinted at in some of the things Bashir said. There's the danger of growing sympathy for Palestinians being expressed in anti-Semitic terms. And I'm sure, I know this is true in the Arab world to a large extent, and it's tragic to see. So how do we confront this? Well, there is an anti-racist wave that has to be, a racist wave that has to be dealt with. So we need to build alliances, whether within the Labour Party, if it survives, or outside it. Black Lives Matter brought to the fore a huge number of really important issues about systemic racism, about scapegoating, about othering, about colonial history. So many matters that we all need to be united together to deal with. And of course, all of those struggles are affected in a negative way by the IHRA mechanism and that approach to racism. I don't know if anybody's noticed, but there's now a thing called the Labour Muslim Network, which has adopted the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims definition of Islamophobia, which is modelled exactly on the IHRA definition and carries some of the same dangers. This is not a positive way to deal with racism. We are facing a situation where people talk glibly about zero tolerance and they have no understanding of what racism really is and how it's embedded in the social structures in our society and how it should be dealt with. So certainly in JVL, we're very engaged at the moment in trying to look at ways of developing alliances which can look at what racism really is and how it can seriously be combated without resorting to these kind of identity politics definitions and so on. Okay, so I mean that does have to be said. I think it's very important. One of the casualties of this whole unpleasant business about anti-Semitism is that people no longer know what real anti-Semitism is. It's now associated with upsetting people. So the latest directive from David Evans, the General Secretary, which has resulted in my suspension and loads of others, is the idea that if you have a discussion about topics which are offensive or upsetting or simply make certain people feel uncomfortable, then that brands you as an anti-Semite, and therefore you are of such a danger to your comrades in your Labour Party that you need to be suspended administratively. This is the situation. However, let's be clear, it's true that people do not have a right not to be offended in political discourse, but it's also true that we do not have a duty to offend others. And I think there is a tendency for people to slip into an attitude by which they feel very proud of themselves if they've managed to upset a Zionist by breakfast time. And that in itself is not a way to either win political arguments or build movements or deal with the kind of anti-Semitism and other forms of racism we're facing. So let's look at how we can educate people about all forms of bigotry without resorting to unhelpful concepts of zero tolerance and so on. I'm nearly done. I think it's really important in learning, in dealing with the anti-Semitism allegations, particularly against the BDS movement, that we have lessons to learn from what's going on in Germany at the moment. Really seriously alarming. Brian Eno, influential musician and producer, I'm sure you know, and an Israeli Jewish musician called Nirit Summerfield, have been caught up in a terrible climate of intolerance and censorship resulting from the parliament in Germany passing a resolution last year which equates BDS with anti-Semitism. And the result of this has been that Brian Eno has been abruptly deplatformed from a show that was planned to take place in Frankfurt. And the reason is that he has been a long-time supporter of boycott, divestment and sanctions. It's extraordinary because he'll ever be associated with Berlin through his collaboration on David Bowie's iconic Berlin Trilogy albums. Today, he will not be allowed to appear there because of his public support for Palestinian human rights. In Nirit Summerfield's case, she has been refused funding after the Munich municipality asked to vet her performance material. She was asked by a local venue to confirm that she would not There would not be any anti-Semitic content in her show. This is a woman whose grandfather was killed in the Nazi genocide, who mourns and celebrates her Jewish past and present through song. There's nothing anti-Semitic in her performances. However, she has been long a critic of Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people, and therefore she's the subject of the ire of local pro-Israel lobbyists, and she is now no platformed. This is bringing about a reaction, as it should. Top cultural institutions have made an unprecedented joint statement against this wave of repression. They're not supporters of BDS, but they can see the dangers in this wave of censorship, which is resulting from the adoption of the IHRA definition. And there has also been a large-scale response by artists supporting the, internationally, supporting the movement of those cultural institutions. We need to build on this. We need to build a free speech movement, and one that is not based on the sort of libertarian right-wing free speech arguments of people like Toby Young and Douglas Murray, who simply want the right for the powerful to abuse the powerless with impunity. So it's a very fine line to tread. Finally, I feel that the best way that we can fight against this censorship, this gagging, this no platforming, and the attempt to shrink the space for Palestinian discourse is just to express our solidarity with the Palestinians louder and clearer. So, I mean, I think we should really start preparing now for next year's Israeli Apartheid Week, which will be in March, and the European groupings which gather to plan and organise with the Palestinian Boycott National Committee are already working on this. So let's state loud and clear, we will not be silenced, and Palestinian human rights is primary for us. And we will also fight in the Labour Party against the repression that's going on there. So thank you very much. I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Naomi. Of course, I agree with every word you said. Just following on from something you said, there has actually in Israel been a movement in recent years of young people demonstratively moving, emigrating to Berlin as a rejection of everything that Zionism stands for. And there was a hit record in Israel a couple of years ago, Farewell, We're Going to Berlin. If anybody's interested, I can share it with them later. Our final speaker will be someone I've known and worked with for even longer than Naomi. Chris Khamis is a long-term activist, a member of a noted Palestinian family. You may have seen the film about his aunt, Anna's children, made by his cousin Giuliano, who was murdered by right-wing extremists nearly 10 years ago. Chris is a veteran of the Labour movement, of the Solidarity movement, and was instrumental in Labour black sections in the 70s and 80s, and has also been involved in several letters to the press about the rights of Palestinians in the Labour Party. So we're really pleased to have him here with us. Off you go, Chris.
Thanks very much, Roland. And actually, you've given me a lead into a number of points I wanted to make. The first thing I was going to say is that I was asked to speak about how Palestinians are treated in the Labour Party. And I could give a very simple answer, which is we're ignored. Right? It's the same tactic that was used for a lot against Jeremy Corbyn. You saw it against Bernie Sanders in America. And it's just, let's just ignore them. Let's not listen, not even let's suppress their right, but let's ignore them. So you won't find, as far as I know, any Palestinian or British Palestinian who has been suspended from the Labour Party. In fact, the number of Jewish members of the Labour Party who've been suspended for expressing some criticism of Israel is way, way above any Palestinian ones. So I could end just there, but I want to make a few other points. I'll just give a few examples of the ignoring. One is that I wasn't a signatory to the excellent letter that Bashir mentioned, because I didn't know about that one. But I was a signatory to an earlier letter, which made some of the same points, not nearly as eloquently. I mean, I really recommend everyone to read that Guardian letter and circulate it wherever they can, because it's a very, very powerful letter. And it's a letter that talks about the importance of uniting fights against racism, including the fight against racism against Palestinians with the fight against anti-Semitism. But there was another letter that just made a smaller point about you must allow Palestinians to have the space to talk about their oppression and the repression and the denial of human rights and national rights. And this was taken around virtually every Labour publication, e-publication and otherwise, and nobody would publish it. It had to, in the end, be circulated via, Jewish Voice for Labour, but that's not an official Labour Party organisation, so it's not affiliated officially. So they gave it publicity, but others did not. So that was just one very recent example. Another more personal, immediate one, but with my brothers and sister, we wrote 2 letters. Once when the leadership campaign was on, we wrote to all the candidates after there was a horrific acceptance of the 10 demands of the BOD, the Board of Deputies, and pointing out, and then we wrote another one after Starmer was a leader. Both were ignored, never replied to. But what we pointed out was that the IHRA definition was actually racist definition and denied speech. And we used the example of our father, who was studying in Britain in 1948, tried to get back. He was studying on the British Council Scholarship. He tried to get back. He was born, bred, spent all his life in Palestine until then. Tried to get back and was told, to cut the story a bit shorter, that basically he couldn't go back because he was a refugee. Even though he'd never fled, he was studying in Britain and so on. And we made the point that if he was Jewish, he'd have got in automatically. But the fact that he was born there and so on, he wasn't. And then we made the point that this is just one example of stories that millions of Palestinians around the world would recognize. Some who'd been pushed out, some who'd fled from the fighting or whatever, but that racism. We never got an answer to that. And in fact, this ignoring goes back as far as the Chakrabarti report, because we did submit, and I organized a number of, not just within our family, but other Palestinians, to submit things pointing out that, that the anti-Semitism thing was being used to try and suppress Palestinian voices. And it didn't get a mention in the Chakrabarti report. We didn't kick up a fuss about that because most of what was in the Chakrabarti report was pretty good, and it was a step forward from what you were seeing before. And that's why it got accused of being a whitewash without any evidence. In fact, that's one of the techniques that the Zionists use. And you see it in the CAA, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, so-called, is that they just throw out, just make statements, no backing, no evidence, the Trumpian style. We just make a statement and that must be true. So despite that, if I just make a point around the Chakrabarti report, despite them saying it was a whitewash, it certainly wasn't a whitewash, and it was a reasonable report, and it could have actually put the Labour Party in a better position if it was implemented. And actually the biggest ignoring is very recently, towards the end of November, when it was the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinians, which is a United Nations appointed day. And so what did the leader and deputy leader of the Labour Party do? That's Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner. What did they do? They went and attended a JLM, Jewish Labour Movement and Labour Friends of Israel meeting where Angela Rayner promised to expel thousands, if necessary, of people and so on. And okay, you might have forgiven some of that if they'd also made some statement about Palestinians, deathly quiet. And there's been another letter organised by my sister, signed by a very wide range of people, which has also been ignored, pointing out that this was making Palestinians feel unsafe in the Labour Party. So one of the things we've got to do is to stop, is to stop this ignoring. And actually this ignoring becomes an international one, because while this has all been going on, has the Labour Party made any statement about the threats of annexation that are still there despite this dreadful alliance, which we've known has always been there between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and so on. But the annexation thing hasn't been mentioned. The continual killings and demolitions that go on, the continual humiliation, the continued barbaric medieval siege of Gaza, when Gaza is actually facing a huge coronavirus epidemic. It hasn't got the health structures to really cope with it, despite people like Medical Aid for Palestine, for Palestinians doing fantastic efforts there and so on. While this is going on, nobody is commenting on the fact that Israel has got this blockade there. So we've got to fight again to make sure that the Palestinian, that in battling for free speech, we don't just battle for that, but continue to point out what Israel is doing to Palestinians and how Palestinians are peacefully fighting back. And that means the BDS movement as well. I just want to go off on a tangent. I hope I'm not using too much time, but just to say, it's not surprising to me that so many Jewish anti-Zionists are being suspended and expelled, because that's been the history of Israel. And if I could make a personal story to illustrate it, but Roland mentioned Arna Meir, who was the mother of my cousin, the Jewish woman who originally fought with the Palmach in 1948. Palmach were the elite commander unit in the Haganah, but then switched and realized the way the Palestinians were being treated and moved over, did some fantastic work, supported by her son Giuliano Meir Khamis, who was a well-known actor in Israel. And they did a lot of theatre work, theatre as a sort of psychological getting over things and so on. And you can see this if you ever watch the fantastic movie Arna's Children. And Giuliano carried on with this freedom theatre and established that and so on. But coming back to Arna, there was a time when we did manage to get into to what I call occupied Palestine, but it's within the Green Line, within the pre-67 borders, to see that side of the family. And Arna was there at my grandfather's house at the time. I was only 6 years old, so this is a story that's been told to me, so I can't remember this, but it was told by my mother. Some of the Israeli army turned up to talk to my grandfather about something, and they saw Arna there and just cold shouldered her, ignored her, and sort of almost spat at her. And she just said to my mother, you see, they hate me more than they hate Palestinians because they see me as a traitor. And that's always been the case. And that's why we as Palestinian activists stand completely solidly and with all these brave people who've stood by us. Right? And I'm getting emotional about it. But you know, when you're being pushed around and treated like that, when people who would normally be seen on the oppressor side stand with you, and the appreciation that people, you can see it across so many oppressed groups when this happens. So if you could take that, Naomi, into full solidarity with you, with Tony, who's listening in, with Moshe Makava, who's always been fantastic. Anyway, so what I want to finish off though is the link that Roland mentioned. I asked to be put on that I was a strong activist in the Labour Party black sections, because what is going on is more than an attack on Palestinians, more than an attack on Jewish anti-Zionists. This is an attack on the whole anti-racist movement. It's weakening the whole attack. It's actually reinforcing anti-Semitism between people who are too thick to understand what's really going on. Because you'll have people say, well, why are these Jewish people saying that they should have rights over and above everyone else, and drawing anti-Semitic conclusions from it. But it's also, if you look at the sort of the complaints, that as soon as the IHRA report came out and Keir Starmer made his statement, the campaign against anti-Semitism had a 72-page report with attack, I think it was on 13 people, a number of whom were black, well-known black activists like Martha Rosamore, who's now in the House of Lords, who worked really hard with us on black sections and was also a leading light in Tottenham on the Broadwater estate. People can remember that far back. Sorry for people who are a lot younger than us. And then there's recently, and people like Dawn, who stood for the, sorry? Oh, anyway, who stood for the deputy leader. All these people are being attacked because they made Palestinian ones. And you've seen it recently also, an attack on another old friend of mine, Roger Mackenzie, who's Assistant General Secretary of Unison, who stood in the Unison General Secretary one, who I hope wins, but I'm a bit pessimistic because the left has been really divided on this. But that's another issue. But he had a complaint put in against him from the Labour against anti-Semitism, which Naomi would correct me on them. I think it's a one-person ban by some guy who just decided to do that. And I read this, I got hold of the accusations made against him. One of them was actually absolutely amazing. I mean, he retweeted a cartoon which said, this is Israel's idea of the two-state solution. Right? And it had on one side Israel saying the Israeli state, you know, the Jewish state on this side. The other thing was Gaza state prison. And it showed a couple of Palestinians in a, you know, open air prison with a wiring around them and so on. And this accusation said, oh, this could be seen as maybe alluding to concentration camps in Germany, and this might upset a few Jewish Labour members, etc. My reaction is, listen, if you're going to get upset, if we mention that Israel is oppressing Palestinian people, you know, and you're going to get a little bit upset, tough shit, right? You have to recognize what's going on. And if anybody wants to say that's racist, I'll throw this statement back at them, that you're trying to, you know, you are the racist if you're doing that. So if I finish off at this point, to take up the case that, the example that Naomi mentioned, when Keir Starmer was on LBC, and I don't want to focus so much on his inability to respond. I mean, I think it was partly because he just has no real feel for the racism that non-white people face in Britain. And that was another factor. But the really thing that stood out for me was another example of how the far right in Britain, and this is important because the far right's been growing in time, how the far right uses and has supported Israel and uses Israel again and again to justify its position. And I'd seen this before because a couple of times when we'd organized our regular Palestinian store in Birmingham, where I used to live, twice the EDL turned up, the English Defence League turned up, waving Israeli flags to harass and try and disturb our store. The people who were following news in the West Midlands, there was a planning permission put in place in Dudley for a mosque in there. And there was a huge Islamophobic, well, it's actually basically racist because most Muslims are dark. And so, you know, the whole Islamophobia thing and racism gets mixed up together. But they at one point, the anti-mosque brigade, which was organized a lot by the EDL, occupied high buildings around where the mosque was supposed to be built, and they were flying Israeli flags. And I think this is a point we need to make again and again to the waverers, some of the people who claim to be anti-racist, but well, we've got to worry about, you know, this anti-Semitism has gone a bit far, and who are confused, to just point out how Israel is being used by the far right. They haven't abandoned their anti-Jewish positions. No way. You know, a lot of them are still Nazis and so on. But you know, sending the Jewish people to Israel suits them very well because then we don't have Jewish people in Britain anymore. And secondly, I think this is my own theory, but they hate Muslims even more than they hate Jews, and so they think Israel beats up Muslims very well. So we like what Israel's doing. Sorry, that's not a very scientific theory, but that's just sometimes what I get the feeling of. So what is really, really important is that in the anti-racist movement, when you're a minority, you need alliances. And Jewish people are a minority in Britain. There's no doubt there's been a rise of anti-Semitism. I'd say it's not been as great as anti-black racism and the rise of that, but it's there and it needs to be stopped and condemned and really fought against. But if you're in a minority, you need alliances. It's that simple, you know. And everything that the Zionist lobby is doing is trying to destroy those alliances, right? And it's interesting that they got rid of Mark Wadsworth, who's a key Labour Party black section activist. And in fact, if you look at the Masha Makova, sorry, my last point here, if you look at the Masha Makova accusations, right, there's a really disgraceful thing going on in the twisting of it, because they don't mention Mark Wadsworth so far, but they mention Jackie Walker and Tony Greenstein, and you've associated with them, and then they say, and they were kicked out with allegations of anti-Semitism were involved somehow. None of those three, Jackie Walker, Tony Greenstein, or Mark Wadsworth, were expelled for anti-Semitism because that charge could not stick because it was basically a dreadful lie, okay? They were expelled on that catch-all phrase of bringing the party in disrepute, when in fact the people who brought it into disrepute are the Zionists, the people outside, and that's what they want to do. And I'll finish there. Thanks very much.